I'm your host, Ben Dietrich. You're on American View here today, and joining us in the studio is Senator DeMint from South Carolina. Senator, thank you for joining us today.
Hey, Ben, it's great to be with you. It's great to be on campus here at Hillsdale.
Yeah, so I understand you're here on behalf of the Convention of States. So why don't you go ahead and tell our listeners briefly what exactly is the Convention of States?
Well, Ben, our country is on an unsustainable course. And the only way that we have to rein in the federal government, to do such things as balance the budget and to get them out of all the business of the states, is to use the tools that our founders gave us in the Constitution. Article 5 gives the states the ability to come together, propose amendments to restore the original limits on the federal government, and then for 38 states to ratify that. It's really the only tool I think we have left. I've spent years trying to elect good people, trying to change things myself as a congressman and senator, and I just realized we're not going to fix it in Washington. The only thing left is for the states to come together and do what our founders intended.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the founders, and I brought a quote with me today from George Washington's farewell address. We were reading it the other day in class, and he mentioned altering the Constitution in that farewell address, and he said this of it. First, he made the reminder that, quote, to resist with care the spirit of innovation upon its principles. And then later on also made the reminder to, quote, remember that time and habit are at least as necessary to fix the true character of governments as of other human institutions. Do you agree with Washington there? Do you think the Convention of States effort agrees with that statement?
Oh, yeah, I think it does. I think we have been very patient as a people, as states, for far too long, allowing the federal government to essentially switch the roles that were intended in the Constitution. A republic is based on autonomous states and a very limited Republican form of government. Those roles have switched. We now have a very powerful national government with limited role at the state level. The only way we have to restore it, again, goes back to what the founders envisioned. They knew the federal government would get too large. They warned us that the natural order of things is for government to increase and for freedom to decrease. So now it's the role of states to call for a convention to propose amendments that would rein in the federal government and restore some fiscal sanity.
And so when you do that, of course, one of the major criticisms from critics is this concept of a runaway convention.
Right.
And last week we saw, the March for Our Lives, a lot of protesters who, a lot of them very, possibly could want to repeal, for instance, the Second Amendment if we were to have such a convention of states. What's to stop those types of people from, doing something so drastic as repealing an amendment like the Second Amendment?
Well, I can guarantee you 38 states will never ratify an amendment that limits the Second Amendment. But I can also tell you it is very likely that Congress will, and already did. The budget that was passed put more limits on Second Amendment rights. It's very possible the Supreme Court could limit or completely throw out the Second Amendment. So a lot of people on the left, a former justice of the Supreme Court just this past week, called for the elimination of the Second Amendment. So the dangers of losing our rights are much greater with the federal government, with Congress, with the courts, than with 38 states. So I've worked in Washington, and I can tell you, if you're worried about losing your rights, don't do anything.
Mm-hmm. And so why do you think, though, that is? Why do you think that the states, for instance, you can rely on them more so than what happens in Washington, D.C.?
Well, generally the states are more conservative than the Congress or the courts, just because of what's happened over many, many years and just the tendency of folks in Washington to be more to the left, more central power oriented. But you've got 33 state legislatures now controlled by Republicans. Now, they're not all necessarily conservative in my way of thinking, but it does show, and if you look at an election map after the 2016 elections, it's practically all red, except for some large states. So our freedoms are much safer in the hands of the collective states than they are, and all you have to do is look at the evidence. I mean, over the years, we've lost our ability as a people to choose our own schools, to make our own decisions about health care. States have lost their right to basically decide where their roads and bridges are going to be. Energy markets have been completely regulated. So the risk of states proposing and ratifying amendments that would limit their own freedom, there's just no risk at all. The risk, again, is not doing anything.
So you mentioned the governors as well as the state legislators that tend to be more conservative. if there were to be a big upset, let's say in these upcoming midterms, and we saw that shift, if we saw the Republicans lose a lot of those governorships, it could indicate that the American people have shifted as well in their own beliefs. Would that concern you, regarding the Convention of States effort?
Well, it would concern me, but I start from the knowledge that what we're doing now in Washington is not working, and that I know that Washington is no longer politically able to stop reckless spending. They're no longer politically able to give power back to the states. So when I think of risk, I think of what's going to happen if we leave things in Washington the way they are. For states to come together and propose amendments is no risk at all. Congress can propose amendments any day it meets. So what we're looking at is using, again, the Constitution, where the founders put the states in charge of the amendment process. Congress's only role is they could propose them, but states can propose them and ratify them. And so that's what our founders intended, and I think that's where our freedoms are the safest.
So tell me a little bit about some of those changes you would want to make to the Constitution should that we have a Convention of States.
The Convention of States project proposes 3 subject matter areas to work on. The first one is to limit the federal government fiscally and restore sanity, basically, with ideas like a balanced budget, limit the tax rate, and use general accounting principles so you can't fudge on everything like we're doing now. The second subject matter area is to limit the authority and jurisdiction of the federal government, allowing states more freedom to design their own education programs, health care, control their own energy development, a lot of things that they should be able to do and they were intended to do by the 10th Amendment. We want to restore that. And the third subject matter area is to limit the terms of federal officials, congressmen, senators, judges, maybe even bureaucrats.
Well, I want to ask you about all of those, but first the first and the third. Balanced budget, term limits. Why didn't the founders include that in the first place?
Well, I don't think our founders could have envisioned a Congress that ever approved this kind of debt. They were debt averse. They could have not imagined a Congress that was accruing debt that they never intended to pay back. So I don't think they anticipated that. And as the term limit part, they assumed that this would be limited terms because the conditions weren't good, the pay was very poor, and there was very limited power in Washington when this all first started. So again, not something they did not anticipate that there would be a problem with professional politicians at that time. So I think as we've seen over time, these are things that could actually restore the original intent of the Constitution of citizen statesmen representing instead of professional class of politicians. And again, ideas of a limited federal government with enumerated powers. There are no enumerated powers. I've been there. I can tell you it never comes up.
Right. Well, and you mentioned, in your own words, restore the original intent, which does beg the question that, or it prompts the question that, it does seem that the issue here is the fact that people are not interpreting the Constitution as it was intended to be.
Right.
And so if you rewrite the Constitution, are you really going to solve that problem, that first problem of, lawmakers misinterpreting the Constitution, the citizens perhaps being misinformed?
Well, it's a great question, but I believe after being there that if the constitutional amendment is clear, that Congress will follow it, and so will the courts. Right now, this original Constitution is no longer relevant, no longer operative in Washington. I hate to tell you that at Hillsdale, and I know you do some of the best courses on it in the country. But what we use now is a compilation of case law and precedent. It's a 2,800-page document called an annotated Constitution, and case law basically obliterates all the limits in the articles of our Constitution right now. The Congress does follow that Constitution, but the problem is there's so much gray area because of case law, because there are cases that land on both sides that when the justices of the Supreme Court are deciding a case, I can guarantee you they don't go to that pocket Constitution. They open this book of case law and go all the way through it, and it's not anything that would give a definitive decision. What we want to do, and I call them clarifying amendments, to clarify that the Commerce Clause is about regulating trade between states, not education, not agriculture, not health care, but case law has said that it allows the federal government to regulate all of that. And so you can, again, look all through the Constitution. The case law has obliterated all enumerated powers, and we need to clarify that original intent so that Congress cannot get around it.
I think you make a good point there. Another concern, though, that has come up, speaking to some of these issues, though, for instance, you mentioned the Commerce Clause and
right.
what the interpretation of that is. We already live in a very divided nation, as you know, especially with the recent, not so recent anymore, election of Donald Trump. And so do you think, though, if we amend the Constitution and clarify these things, instead of going to the people and trying to solve these issues by, changing their minds on them, if we change the laws first, is that going to make us more divided?
Actually, the reason we're divided is when one person is making the decisions for a whole lot of people, it frustrates a lot of people. But if the decisions are moved down where people are making their own decisions about how they live and what they value, then you can live together in unity. You probably have roommates or people you go to school with here that you disagree on, but as long as they can't tell you how to live and what to believe, you can be friends. What happens when Washington decides where you go to school, what you're going to learn, what they can say in churches, what your health care, what your doctorate's going to be, then everybody starts getting frustrated. The idea of the Convention of the States is not about what we decide. It's about where we decide it and who decides it. It's moving the decisions from Washington back to the states and back to the people. And that will actually unify our nation. It's really out of many one. You've got to have the many. But you can be united and live together with a lot of diversity if you're not imposing your ideas on someone else. And that's what national elections are about now, is who is going to impose their idea on the rest of the people. We need to get out of that because that's what's created such disunity, disharmony in America today. What unites people is the ability to make your own decisions.
Right. And speaking towards that uniting again, one of the things that has been, I think, troubling for some people with even though the Republicans have the House, they have the Senate, they have the presidency now, is the amount of compromise that has had to go in to get things to be passed, like this last budget that we saw.
Right.
And, sometimes some very terrible things can come out of that. Yeah. There's a pretty high threshold for you to make amendments to the Constitution, correct? There's 2/3 of states have to agree. So are we going to be compromising with states like California, or other liberal states in order to make amendments to the Constitution? And are those really compromises we want to make?
Well, the compromise will be different at the state level. If you've got South Carolina and California sitting next to each other, and they're both proposing an amendment that would allow them to decide, then California doesn't have to do what South Carolina does. It's a very different decision in Washington when you're trying to decide what both California and South Carolina will have to do. That causes the problem. So I believe that you can get states with very different ideas to come together around this idea once they realize what we're talking about. It's not necessarily we want a conservative agenda for California. Right. We want California to be able to decide if they want to be a socialist republic. That's their right.
I think you make a fair point there. And for a lot of the amendments that would probably come, that would be the case, the ones that involve, returning the power to the states. But what about if, for instance, California, if for instance, California said, we would not agree to any of these other amendments if we don't have a repeal of the Second Amendment, so to speak. Does that concern you at all, that the Republicans would be left, or conservatives would be left with the decision, do we have to slide on some issues or on one of these amendments to get these others? Is it worth it?
Well, there could be some horse trading at the convention itself when the amendments are first proposed. But that kind of compromise is not going to affect the ratification process, where the amendments are going to come separately to the states. They're not going to be all balled up. And an amendment to basically revoke the Second Amendment is not going to be ratified, while the others will. So you're not going to have a bundle coming out of this convention where it's all or nothing. That's what I like about it. The states may get 5 or 6 amendments from the convention. They may ratify 1 or 2. But what my hope is, and Ben just taking it a step further, is that states originally had a lot of oversight over the federal government. They appointed the U.S. senators. That
Right.
was changed with the 17th Amendment, which in retrospect, I think if people understood what they did, they would realize that was a huge mistake. For me, the Article 5 gives the states the right to get back involved. Not just once, but my hope would be that every couple of years that they would get together and provide oversight over what the Supreme Court has done or what a district judge has done. And if they feel like it's necessary to propose a clarifying amendment to rein them back in or overrule a decision that was made, they have that right. And what that would do, Ben, is just make Washington behave.
So to clarify, though, so you're saying, though, you want to have regular conventions?
I would like. I mean, that's a step down the road, but I don't see this as a one-and-done process. If states should be engaged in overseeing the business of the federal government because they form the federal government. And if they don't keep it accountable, then it's almost impossible to keep it accountable.
Right. And lastly, of course, I think even those who maybe don't agree with you on the Convention of States, they probably would agree with you on this point, which is that it's not just one action that's going to solve the many issues that we're faced with today. In your opinion, what other things that should we be doing in addition to a Convention of States that's going to help restore our Constitution, restore the principles that our nation was founded upon?
Well, most of the things that would help are in those three subject matter areas, particularly the middle one of the authority and jurisdiction. You'll never balance the budget if you don't get the federal government out of so many things that it can't do well and that it can't afford to do. So I think, again, most of the things that would move this process along are in those three subject matter areas. That's why I'm working on this particular project, while others may be working on an Article 5 just for a balanced budget. For me, I realize that could actually do more harm than good. If you don't make the government operate by general accounting principles, if you don't limit their ability to tax, then forcing a balanced budget could create havoc up there. And if you don't get them out of all of these things, then what's happening now is we're not going to fund the things they're supposed to do, like the military, because we're trying to run the healthcare system and the education system in the country, which they were never intended to do.
What do you think about outside the scope of government, though? Is there anything? I know it's kind of outside your specialty as being a former senator and then also working with this effort, but what about the American people? Is there anything that needs to be changed there? I mean, George Washington talked a lot about the concept of a virtuous citizenry. Yeah.
Well, we can't sustain our country without a knowledgeable and active citizenry. I mean, everything was dependent on that. You know, Ben Franklin walked out of the Constitutional Convention and told a lady, "You have a republic if you can keep it." Now, and the whole implication there was, it's all on you, lady. It's on the citizens. And so the government is not our country. I mean, the citizens, we the people, are our country, and the government needs to be subservient to the people. And if every citizen could get that in their mind, that they're not sitting here waiting for the government to do something to them, it's their job to control their government. It's your responsibility as a citizen. So for people to sit back and say, this is not my job. And, you know, what really bothers me now, Ben, is for someone to look at where we are as a country, where the federal government is, our debt or whatever, and then tell me it's risky to do something. And if you know how things work, if we don't do anything, we could lose our country. That's going to be more of a problem for you than for me. But this is a tool. It's a constitutional tool. It's a peaceful tool that citizens can come together and make a difference. And, you know, I'm tired of voting and complaining.
Yeah.
That's about all the rest of the country can do right now, except get their state representatives to come together and pass a resolution calling for a convention. The risks are zero.
Mm-hmm. Well, Senator, we're out of time here, but thank you so much. For those who've been listening, you've been listening to Senator DeMint. He's an advocate of the Convention of States effort. He's a senior advisor to that effort. He's a former senator from South Carolina and also the former president of the Heritage Foundation. That was an American View exclusive.